Maybe some of you will recall 2 weeks ago, I delivered a message about being lukewarm, and I've been now exploring over the past Sundays after that reasons perhaps leading to some being lukewarm. Last Sunday's message was about regret. This Sunday's message is ready, as in, are you? The text is taken from James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. Just a moment now. You who say, we're going to such and such a city today or tomorrow, we'll stay there a year doing business and make a profit. How do you know what will happen even tomorrow? What, after all, is your life? It's like a puff of smoke, visible for a little while and then dissolving into thin air. Your remarks should be prefaced with, if it is the Lord's will, we shall be alive and will do so and so. As it is, you get a certain pride in yourself in planning your future with such confidence. That sort of pride is all wrong. No doubt you agree with the above in theory. Well, remember that if a man knows what is right and fails to do it, his failure is a real sin. I think it's very easy for all of us to think about today as perhaps just another day. On average, a typical day where we go through life concerned with our to-do lists, we're preoccupied by appointments, we're focused on our families, and thinking about perhaps our desires and our needs. On the average day, many of us live a life that's caught up in ourselves. On the average day, we don't consider God very much. Maybe sometimes not at all. On the average day, we forget that life is like smoke, as James described it. The truth is, there's nothing normal about today. Just think about everything that has to function properly just to survive. Take your liver, for example. The only people who really think about their livers are people whose livers don't work very well. The majority of us take our livers, for instance, for granted, including other internal organs that we're dependent upon to live. Or what about driving down the road at 70 miles an hour, only a few feet from cars who are traveling that same speed in the opposite direction? It would only take someone to move slightly and we'd be gone. And I don't think that that's morbid. I mean, that's just reality. It's crazy that we think today is just a normal day to do whatever we want to do with it. And to those of us who might say, as James says, well, we're going to such and such a city today or tomorrow, we'll stay there, we'll make a profit. James writes, how do you even know what will happen tomorrow? What, after all, is your life? It's like a puff of smoke. It's visible for a little time and then dissolves into thin air. When we really think about it, what James just said is just a little disconcerting. But even after reading that verse, do we really believe that we could vanish in a minute? Or do we instead feel somehow that we're invincible? A theologian, his name is Frederick Buechner, writes this: intellectually, we all know that we will die, but we do not really know it in the sense that the knowledge becomes a part of us. We do not really know it in the sense of living as though it were true. On the contrary, we tend to live as though our lives would go on forever. Now, I used to believe that there were just two kinds of people in the world. The one category was natural worriers, and the other category is just naturally joyful people. And I will tell you that I am in the worrying camp. But I don't really call it worry. I use euphemisms like, I'm just a little concerned. Or the situation makes me feel just a little unsettled. Or I guess I'm just overthinking the situation. Or maybe I suppose I'm just a tiny bit stressed. I am a problem solver. That's my job. That's my career. That's what I do. So I have to focus every day of my professional career on fixing legal problems. So certainly, I think to myself, God can see that my intensity and my anxiety are work-related, right? Didn't he give me my job in the first place? And so I worry because I take the work that he's given to me extremely seriously. But then there's this very perplexing command from Paul the apostle. He is writing from a jail cell. And he's writing to this little church that he and his friend Silas had established in Greece. And writing to the church in Philippi, in Philippians chapter 4, verse 4, Paul writes, "Rejoice in the Lord always." And again, I will say it, rejoice. Notice that it doesn't end with, unless you're doing something really important. No, it's a command for all of us with the charge, don't worry about anything. That's in verse 6. It's a pretty staggering command. And I've found that when I'm consumed by my problems, when I'm stressed out about life or my job, I actually convey that belief that I think my circumstances are really more important than God, and certainly more important than God's command to rejoice. In other words, I believe I have the right to disobey God because of the magnitude of my responsibilities. But worry implies that I or us don't quite trust that God is big enough, or that our God is powerful enough, or that God is even loving enough to take care of what's happening in our lives today. And stress says that the things that we're involved in are important enough to merit our impatience or our lack of grace sometimes toward others, or our tight grip of control. Basically, these two behaviors communicate that it's okay to sin and not trust God because the stuff in my life is somehow exceptional. In a word, worry and stress reek of arrogance. They declare our tendency to forget that we've been forgiven, that our lives here are brief, that we're headed to a place where we won't be lonely, and we won't be afraid, and we won't be hurt ever again, and that in the context of God's strength, our problems are very small. So why are we then so quick to forget about God? I mean, who do we think we are? I don't know about you, but I have to relearn this lesson very often. Even though I glimpse God's holiness, I'm still dumb enough to forget that life is all about God and not about me at all. It's like being an extra in a movie. An extra. Scrutinizing that one scene where hundreds of people are milling around just waiting for that 2/5 of a second when you see the back of your head. Now, maybe your wife, maybe your husband, maybe your best friend, maybe your mother might be impressed with your 2/5 of a second. Maybe. But no one else will even realize that it's you, right? Even if you tell them, they're not going to care. It's 2/5 of a second of the shot of the back of your head among hundreds of heads in the scene. But then what if you rented out the theater on opening night and invited all your friends and family to come see the new movie about you? People would say, Randy, you're an idiot. How could you even begin to think that the movie is about you? Unfortunately, many of us are like that extra because we live like the movie is all about us. So let me remind you, church, here's the real movie. God creates the world. Then people rebel against God, and God floods the earth to rid it of the mess that people had made. Several generations later, God singles out a 99-year-old man, Abram, and makes him the father of a nation. Later, along come characters like Joseph and Moses and Mary and Deborah and many others, but they're all very ordinary people with very inadequate lives. And the movie is not about them either. God is the one who picks these people. God is the one who directs them. God is the one who works miracles through them. And in the next scene, God judges and prophets and sends prophets to this nation because the people can't seem to give him the one thing that he asks of them: obedience. And then the movie reaches its climax. The Son of God is born among the people whom God still somehow loves. And while in this world the Son teaches his followers what true love looks like, then the Son of God is murdered and is then resurrected and goes back up to be with God. And even though the movie isn't quite yet finished, we know what that last scene of the movie has in store. It's the throne room of God, where everyone will worship God, our God who sits on a throne, for he alone is worthy to be praised. From start to finish, church, the movie is obviously about God. He is the main character. So how is it possible then that we live as though the movie is about us? Our scene in the movie, our brief lives, falls somewhere between the time Jesus ascends into heaven, that's Acts, and when we will all worship God on his throne in heaven, which is in Revelation. We have only our 2/5 of a second long scene to live. Don't we want that 2/5 of a second to mean something? Don't we want that 2/5 of a second having us making everything we can about the great God whom we serve? 1 Corinthians 10:31 says, "So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God." That's what each of our 2/5 of a second is about. So what does that mean for us? Well, that means that we need to get over ourselves. That may sound a little harsh, but that's what it means. Because maybe life's pretty good for you right now. God has given you a lot of good stuff so that you can show the world a person who enjoys blessings, but who is still totally obsessed with God. Or maybe life is tough right now for you, and everything feels like a struggle. God has allowed hard things in your life so you can show the world that your God is great and that knowing him brings peace and joy even when life is hard. Like the psalmist wrote in Psalms chapter 73 or Psalm 73, and I'm skipping it's verses 3, verses 13, and then 16 and 17. I want to condense this so you hear what he has to say. So the psalmist says, I saw the prosperity of the wicked. Surely in vain I kept my heart pure. And when I tried to understand all this, it was oppressive to me until I entered the sanctuary of God. The psalmist is saying, look, I've seen the prosperity of the world, and my life right now is not so good. But I've tried to keep my heart pure, and I don't get it. There are people who are wicked and evil, and they're prospering. I'm trying to do the right thing, and I'm struggling. And it really blows my mind, and I don't understand it. Oh, yeah, until I entered the sanctuary of God. Because it's easy, church, to become disillusioned with the circumstances of our lives compared to others. But in the presence of God, he gives us a much deeper peace and joy that transcends everything. In other words, it doesn't really matter what place we find ourselves in right now. Our part is to bring God the glory. Whether we're eating a sandwich on a lunch break, whether we're drinking coffee at 12:04 in the morning so we can stay awake to study, or maybe watching our 4-month-old take a nap. The point of our life is to point to him. Whatever we're doing, God wants to be glorified because this whole thing is his. It's his movie, it's his world, and it's his gift. But even though God has given us this life, this very brief scene that we have in his movie, we still forget that we're not in control. It's like having a newborn, and now the 5-year-old wants to carry the baby around the house. And you're constantly telling the 5-year-old, be careful, because the baby is fragile. But then when will the newborn no longer be fragile? When the newborn is 2? When the newborn is 8? When the newborn is in junior high? When the newborn is in college? When the newborn is married with kids of their own? Look, life is always fragile. And it's never, ever under control. And it isn't the easiest thing at this point to start living when we want to live in this very guarded state, to be safe, to control our own little world as best we can, to stop taking risks, and to be ruled by our fears of what could happen. Turning inward, obviously, is one way to respond. The other is to acknowledge the fact that we are not in control, because when we do that, it makes us run to the one who is, and that would be God. Just think about it. Throughout time, somewhere between 45 billion and 125 billion people have lived on this planet. That's with a B, 125 billion people. And in about 50 years, give or take a couple, no one will remember us. Everyone we know will have passed. No one will care about the job that we had, or the car that we drove, or the school that we attended, or what clothes we wore. And here's the point I want to make to you, and it has to do with a guy by the name of Stan Gerlach. Stan Gerlach was a very, very successful business person, and he was very active in his community. And he was a flag football coach and did a bunch of really cool stuff in the community in which he lived. And so one day, he was asked to give a eulogy at the memorial service of a friend of his, and it was at that time that Stan decided to share the gospel. And at the end of Stan's message, Stan told the mourners who were there, you never know when God is going to take your life. At that moment, there's nothing you can do about it. Are you ready? Then Stan sat down, bowed his head like he was praying, and died. Attendees tried to resuscitate him, but there was nothing that they could do. Just as Stan had said only a minute earlier. Imagine what it must have felt like for Stan. I mean, one moment he's at a memorial service for a friend saying to a crowd, "This is who Jesus is." And the next moment, he's standing before God hearing Jesus say, "This is who Stan Gerlach is." 1 second, he's confessing Jesus. A second later, Jesus is confessing him. It can happen that quickly. And so the question is, are you ready? Sometimes I believe living as a lukewarm Christian, we don't really want to think about our mortality. I do legal work, as you know. I'm trying to kind of shift my practice away from the litigation stuff, which is suing people and people getting sued, because it's really stressful. I'd rather do stuff that's a lot more genteel, like preparing people's wills and trusts and things like that. I mean, it's a very helpful thing. It's good for their family. They can, make sure that their estate gets transferred in the way that they want to and avoid probate, which is not a really good place to be. I cannot tell you the number of people to whom I've sent out information. They call me, they're so interested. We want to put together a trust for our family. And I send them this checklist. It's not super complicated. And I send it to them, and then all I hear are crickets. And maybe a year, maybe two. In one case, it was 5 years later that they call and they say, we've been working on that checklist. And I say, and it took you 5 years? Well, life gets in the way. Well, what happened? Why are you calling me now? Well, we had a recent death in the family. And that's what happens. People don't want to think about mortality until something close to them happens. But if you're Stan Gerlach, he's preaching to a bunch of mourners at a funeral. It happens to him. And it can happen to us. So I'm not saying this to be morbid. I'm saying this to engage you. Live like it's God's movie, and you've got 2/5 of a second to make a big splash. Do the best you can. Be prepared. Be ready. Because then at that point in time, you can be the greatest actor or actress on the planet. And you can be giving it all to God. And whenever God decides to take you, that's when God decides to take you. So we've picked this next song. Years I spent in vanity and pride, caring not my Lord was crucified. Sometimes I think we go through our Christian life a bit apathetic, or we take stuff for granted. We don't live like it could be over tomorrow or next minute. We just kind of take stuff for granted and go through the motions. Today, be intentional. Listen to this song, sing the words of this song, and then this week, go out and live like you don't have another moment to live. Do everything you can to give God the glory and reflect that in the people with whom you come into contact. And hopefully you live for another 50 years. Talking to Curtis, they just went back to visit his mother. She is 98 years old. She is bright, she is sharp, she is with it. She might live to be 198. She might be a ninja for all we know. So I don't know what the Lord has in store for any of us. But what I do know is this. The moments that you have right now are a gift from God. Treat them accordingly and live like you're 2/5 of a second in God's movie. If you have any prayer requests, you can pass them up. We'll pray over those at the close of this song. And if you would, let's stand and let's sing.